This is my true story. I never imagined that the son I raised with patience and pride would one day treat me like a burden. All I ever wanted was a little respect, a conversation, a moment of warmth. But instead, my voice became something he wanted to silence. One evening, in front of his friends, he slammed my phone on the floor, as if to break not just the device, but my dignity too. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just made one call that changed everything. But before I tell you what happened, please subscribe and share my story. He had lived a lifetime in motion, working through heat, through hunger, through every disappointment the world could throw at a man, just so his son would never have to. Every calloused line on his palm was a story of sacrifice. The day he skipped lunch to buy his son a school uniform. The night he walked home instead of taking a cab so he could save enough for a birthday gift. The weekends he repaired old radios just to pay for music lessons his son would later mock. Every action was a thread of love woven into something that looked like pride, until pride became the weapon that cut the thread itself. He used to believe that love was a simple thing, that a father's care, given freely and without expectation, would plant something permanent in a child's heart. He believed time would protect that love, that it would harden into gratitude. But time, he would learn, doesn't always build. Sometimes it erodes, slowly, grain by grain, until the very thing you thought was strong enough to last forever turns into dust between your fingers. He remembered the early days, when his son was small, all knees and elbows, running through the house calling for him every evening. Back then, every phone call between them carried warmth. His son would call him after school, after college lectures, even from his first job interviews. Those calls were more than words. They were proof that love could travel through a wire, that connection wasn't about distance, but about meaning. He had taught his son that a man's voice, his word, was sacred. When you picked up a call, you picked up trust. When you answered, you honored the bond. But somewhere along the way, the voice that once greeted him with laughter turned sharp, impatient, and short. The conversations shrank. The tone grew colder. His son's success changed something invisible between them, like a window fogging from the inside. The old man would call and wait through the rings, only to hear a distracted, dismissive, "I'm busy." But he excused it every time. He told himself this was how life worked now, that the young were simply too busy for small talk, that the world was louder for them. He told himself not to take it personally. Still, it hurt. That slow, quiet dying of attention. The kind that doesn't make noise, that doesn't bruise, but still empties you a little more each day. The kind that leaves you wondering if you've already become invisible to the very person you once carried in your arms. He never stopped calling. Sometimes he'd dial just to hear the ring, the echo of a past that used to answer. Other times, he'd hold the phone in his palm, staring at it like a photograph, remembering the boy who once waited for him outside the factory gate just to walk home together. He'd saved that boy from storms, from sickness, from bullies. But he couldn't save the man that boy had become from arrogance. When his son opened his own business, the old man had felt proud, genuinely proud. He had even used his retirement savings to help fund the launch. "He'll be stable," he told himself. "He'll remember this when I'm gone." That thought became his quiet comfort in the evenings, his shield against loneliness. He'd sit on the porch, phone beside him, waiting for updates that never came. Over the years, that phone became more than an object. It was a bridge. Every call he made carried a piece of himself, a message wrapped in hope. Sometimes he'd call just to ask if his son was eating well. Sometimes he wanted advice about the house repairs. But mostly, he called just to hear his son's voice, to remind himself that he still existed in his world. The son, however, began seeing those calls differently. What once sounded like love now felt like interference. Every question felt like a judgment, every concern a criticism. Success had made him deaf to tenderness. He'd tell his friends how clingy his father was, how old-fashioned. They'd laugh, and the laughter became the sound of distance, a chorus that buried everything the father had ever tried to build. Even then, the old man held no resentment. He simply withdrew a little, spoke less, waited longer. When he did speak, his words carried softness, not because he was weak, but because he refused to let anger define his final years. Yet, as life would have it, even patience has its breaking point, and his came the day his son shattered his phone on the floor. That moment wasn't about the phone. It wasn't about technology or cost or noise. It was about what that phone represented: a connection, a memory, a bridge that one man destroyed in a single flash of temper. It was the sound of years of love meeting the ground and breaking into pieces too small to fix. He remembered every crack of that phone. Each one felt like a pulse going quiet. He didn't shout or cry. He didn't raise his hands or voice. He just stood there, his eyes holding something stronger than rage: disappointment, the kind that pierces through arrogance and lingers long after the room falls silent. When he picked up the pieces later that night, his fingers trembled, not from age, but from the weight of realization. His son had not only broken a device, he had broken the last thread of civility between them. The same man who once called him hero had now reduced him to an inconvenience, a relic in his own home. He thought about all the times he'd defended his son's behavior to others, to neighbors, to relatives, to himself. "He's just stressed," he'd say. "He's still young." But that night, under the faint light of the kitchen bulb, he stopped defending. He stopped explaining. Something inside him hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. He had built everything in that house: the walls, the roof, the opportunities, and now he would rebuild something else: his self-respect. He decided then that if his son could throw away kindness so easily, he would learn what loss truly felt like. But here was the difference. The father would not fight with fists or screams. He would fight with silence, patience, and one call, the kind of call that doesn't break things but rearranges them. He knew exactly where to make it and who would answer. As he sat by his bed, the broken phone pieces beside him, he smiled faintly. Not a smile of revenge, but of understanding. The world had taken much from him: youth, strength, friends, but it hadn't taken his wisdom. That would be his weapon now. He would use it not to destroy, but to correct, not to punish, but to teach. That night, he slept peacefully for the first time in months, because deep down, he knew. Tomorrow, with one quiet call, the balance would shift. There is a certain kind of pain that doesn't bleed. It builds. It starts small, quiet, hidden between polite words and dismissive gestures. That's how his son's disrespect began. At first, it came in small doses: rolled eyes during conversations, half-hearted replies, forgotten greetings. The kind of disrespect you can mistake for mood or exhaustion. But like rust, it spreads quietly until the foundation starts to give way. The old man noticed the changes long before anyone else did. His son no longer called him Papa. He was just him. No longer asked for advice, only gave orders. It wasn't shouting or insults at first, but tone. That sharp, shallow tone that makes warmth sound like weakness. His son began speaking like a man who believed he had outgrown the man who raised him. The father, though hurt, convinced himself that this was the way of time, that maybe all young men needed to prove themselves by rejecting the old. He began watching his son from a distance, at dinners, at family gatherings, in phone calls. The way he spoke to people, the way his confidence turned into arrogance, the way he corrected his father mid-sentence as if to erase his experience. Respect had become a lost language. When friends visited, his son became a different person: loud, dismissive, full of mockery. If his father tried to speak, he'd interrupt with a smirk, turning wisdom into a punchline. Laughter followed, the kind that sounds like applause for cruelty. It was strange, the way his son seemed to need to humiliate him to feel important. Pride had become his son's drug, and every insult was a dose. At first, the father stayed silent, not because he was weak, but because he understood something his son didn't, that reacting gives power to ignorance. Silence, in his world, had always been strength, but silence is also heavy. It collects, like stones in a bag you can't put down. The old man's patience stretched thinner each day. Calls that once ended with, "Take care" now ended with "I'm busy." Messages left on read. Days when he'd wait by the phone, only to realize no one was calling. He had become an afterthought, someone to check on when guilt allowed. The small things hurt the most: the empty chair beside him during dinner, the forgotten Father's Day card, the birthdays that came with cold text messages instead of a visit. And then came the lies, the excuses about being too busy while he saw his son posting pictures with friends, laughing in restaurants he once helped fund. Every moment felt like a reminder that love, once taken for granted, turns into obligation. The son treated visits like chores, each one shorter than the last. Conversations turned into transactions, requests for money, advice ignored, complaints disguised as jokes. And yet, the father gave. He gave because giving was his language. He gave because he still saw the boy behind the man, the child who once held his hand while crossing the street. That image kept him from breaking. But even the strongest hearts have limits. The turning point came one evening at dinner. The son had friends over, loud and careless. The old man sat quietly at the table, hoping to share a meal, to listen, maybe even to laugh. Instead, he became invisible. They talked over him, ignored his words, treated his presence like furniture. When he tried to join the conversation, his son cut him off sharply, a wave of the hand, a sigh of annoyance. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, that tone that stripped away dignity. The old man sat back, listening to his own child lecture him about how things worked now, as if experience was outdated, as if love was a weakness. Later that night, his son criticized him for using the wrong phone app, called him slow, and laughed when his friends joined in. The old man forced a smile, but something inside him began to fracture. He had spent his entire life teaching patience, kindness, and humility. And now, the student had become the very thing he'd warned him against. It wasn't about technology or age or even misunderstanding. It was about control. His son wanted to feel powerful, and the easiest target was the man who wouldn't fight back. He wanted to assert dominance in every small way, to remind his father that the world now belonged to him. The phone became his favorite symbol of that power. Whenever the father called, his son would delay picking up. If he did answer, it was brief, distracted, irritated. "What now?" became his greeting. It was as if the sound of his father's voice was an inconvenience. There's something cruel about watching your own child unlearn love. It feels like a betrayal of everything you ever believed in. He'd taught his son to build, not to break, to respect age, not mock it, to listen before speaking. And yet, here he was, a mirror shattered, reflecting none of the values he'd poured his life into. The father began keeping to himself. He'd write small notes instead of calling. He'd cook quietly and leave food for his son without expecting thanks. It wasn't submission. It was exhaustion. Sometimes survival means choosing peace over pride, but disrespect doesn't stop when tolerated. It grows bolder. His son started treating him like an employee, giving commands instead of requests. "Do this. Fix that. Stay quiet." Each word chipped away at the bond that had once felt unbreakable. Friends noticed the change. Some said, "You should leave him be. He'll learn when you're gone," but the father wasn't built to abandon. He still believed that people could return to kindness, that maybe one day his son would look back and regret. The day the phone was slammed came after a long stretch of small humiliations, the kind that eat at your spirit. It was the last drop in a bucket that had been filling for years. But before that day arrived, the father had already learned to expect disappointment. That's the saddest part, when betrayal stops surprising you. Every evening, he'd sit in his chair, holding the same old phone, its screen faintly cracked, its ringtone soft and familiar. It wasn't just a device, it was history. It held messages, recordings, photographs, fragments of moments that once mattered. It was the only thing that connected him to the version of his son he still missed. But as his son's arrogance grew, even that small connection became a target. The father could sense the growing tension every time he touched the phone. He knew that one day something would break. He just didn't know it would happen so literally. In the quiet hours of that growing disrespect, the father began keeping mental notes, not of revenge, but of moments. Each insult, each dismissal, each cruel gesture became part of a pattern. He wasn't counting out of anger. He was preparing for the day he would finally draw the line, not with fists, not with shouting, but with calm, absolute action. There was one thing his son had never understood. The patience of an old man is not weakness, it's stored strength. It's the quiet before a storm that has already decided where it will fall. And so, as the days passed and the disrespect deepened, the father began to see things clearly. The son's laughter was loud, but hollow. His arrogance was a mask for fear. His disrespect was a symptom of insecurity. The man who slammed doors and raised his voice was, deep down, afraid of his own emptiness. The father didn't hate him, he pitied him, because love, even when betrayed, never fully disappears. It just changes shape, and soon, that love, that deep, silent, wounded love, would teach the most powerful lesson of all. He would let the son feel the consequence of breaking what could never be replaced: respect. And when that day came, he would make one call, not to destroy, but to restore balance. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind of night that hides its cruelty behind routine. The father had arrived early, carrying groceries, thinking a shared meal might soften the silence that had grown between them. He still believed, even after everything, that warmth could mend coldness. The lights in the house were bright. Laughter echoed faintly from the living room, and for a brief moment he thought he'd walked into his old home again, the one filled with joy, not judgment. But that illusion vanished as soon as he stepped closer. His son sat surrounded by friends, the table cluttered with glasses and noise. They were talking about success, deals, and expensive things. None of them noticed him at first. When they did, the laughter slowed, but didn't stop. The father placed the bag down quietly on the counter and stood for a moment, invisible in his own bloodline. He had come only to ask one small thing, something so ordinary it should have meant nothing. He wanted to confirm a document, a phone number, something trivial related to a payment he was helping with. But that small question, that innocent gesture, would become the spark that revealed everything. The father took out his old phone, the one with scratches and scuff marks, the same phone he had used for years to call his son every evening. He had replaced its screen twice, not because it was valuable, but because it carried memories. That phone had held the laughter of his late wife, the giggles of his young son, the messages from friends now gone. It was his archive of life. He held it out, asking for a number. The son barely looked up. He was too busy talking, showing off a new watch. The father waited politely, his voice soft, the same patience he'd carried through years of fatherhood still intact. When his son finally turned, there was irritation in his eyes, the kind reserved not for strangers, but for burdens. A few seconds of silence passed, heavy and strange. His friends watched. The son frowned, grabbed the phone, and said something sharp, not with words of guidance or help, but with disgust. Then, in one quick, careless motion, he slammed it on the floor. The sound split the room in two, a small crack, followed by the shattering of glass and silence. It wasn't just plastic and metal that broke. It was decades of love, the quiet faith that no matter what, a child would never cross certain lines. The phone lay face down, its back cover half open, the battery sliding out like a heart falling out of rhythm. For a moment, no one moved. The father stood still, staring at the pieces as if watching his entire history disassemble in slow motion. His hands twitched, not from fear, but restraint. The friends stared, unsure of what to say. The son, flushed with misplaced pride, muttered something under his breath and turned away, pretending it hadn't happened. The air was thick, the kind of silence that hums in your ears and sits in your chest like a stone. The old man bent down slowly. Every bone in his body ached, but not as much as his heart. He picked up each piece, the battery, the back cover, the cracked screen. His reflection on that shattered glass looked older than he felt. like time itself had decided to punish him for his faith in love. He said nothing, not one word. The room waited for an explosion, for a tear, for a raised voice, but he gave them none. His silence filled the space heavier than anger ever could. He simply gathered the pieces, placed them in his pocket, and turned toward the door. The walk back home was long. The air was cold, his hands still trembling slightly from the moment. Streetlights flickered above, casting yellow light on the sidewalk, each step echoing like the tick of a clock, marking the end of something sacred. When he reached home, he placed the broken phone on the table and sat down. The pieces looked smaller under the lamp, like fragments of something once alive. He stared at them for a long time, tracing every crack with his eyes. Each fracture told a story, of love given freely, of respect denied, of moments taken for granted. He thought of how many times that phone had rung with his son's voice, asking for help, for advice, for support. He remembered the first time his son called him from school, excited about a good grade. The first time he called after his first job interview. The way his voice used to light up with pride when he said, "Papa, I did it." Now, that same voice had turned sharp, unrecognizable. The word "Papa" had vanished, replaced by silence. The father didn't cry, not because he didn't feel pain, but because he had cried too much in his life already. When his wife passed, when his business failed, when his friends died one by one. Tears were for losses you couldn't prevent. But this was a loss he could still respond to, not emotionally, but intelligently. He reached for a notebook, the same one where he wrote down phone numbers, appointments, and memories. On the first blank page, he wrote, "He broke my phone today." Then, below it, "But tomorrow, I will make a call that will fix more than glass." He sat there, the weight of the decision forming quietly in his mind. He wasn't thinking of revenge. He wasn't thinking of hurting his son. He was thinking of truth, the kind of truth that needed to be shown, not spoken. He remembered something his late wife once said, "A man's dignity doesn't shout. It acts." Those words became his compass that night. He realized his son had mistaken his quietness for weakness, his patience for submission. But patience, when sharpened by pain, becomes precision. He picked up the broken phone one last time, pressed the cracked screen against his palm, and smiled faintly. Tomorrow, he decided, would not be another day of silence. It would be a day of correction. He went to bed early, the broken pieces still on the table beside him. The sound of the shattering replayed in his mind, not as trauma, but as motivation. That sound would no longer mean defeat. It would be the beginning of balance. And as he drifted to sleep, he thought not of anger, but of control. He had lost many things in life: money, health, people. But he had never lost his understanding of how systems worked. He had built things, managed things, solved things. And now he would fix this too, not with rage, but with reason. By the time dawn broke, he already knew what he would do. The plan was simple, lawful, and unstoppable. He would make one call, just one. And with that call, his son's world, built on arrogance, sustained by his father's help, would begin to tremble, just enough to remind him who had held it up all along. That night, the house was quieter than ever before. Even the ticking of the old wall clock sounded like a heartbeat echoing in an empty chest. The old man sat by the table, staring at the broken phone in front of him. Not with rage, not with tears, but with the kind of stillness that only comes when something inside finally settles. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't clouded by confusion or excuses. The scene replayed again and again. The sound of shattering glass, the stunned faces of strangers, the blank look in his son's eyes. But instead of pain, there was clarity. It was as if that single violent moment had burned away the fog of denial he had lived in for years. His son's action wasn't a mistake, not a lapse of emotion. It was truth revealed. He began to realize how long he had been living under the illusion of love, convincing himself that cruelty was stress, arrogance was success, neglect was busyness. He had bent his heart so far to keep peace that it had nearly broken him. But now, sitting in the dim light of that room, he felt something rise in him that had been asleep for years. Resolve. He turned the phone over in his hands, the cracks catching the lamplight like scars. It was strange how much of his life had been tied to that small object, how many of his hopes had traveled through its wires. It had been his companion during lonely nights, his connection to the world that was slowly forgetting him. It had carried his wife's last messages, his old friends' jokes, his business calls. It had carried the sound of his son's voice, a voice that once called him hero, and now called him problem. He thought about that contrast, how a child's love can change so completely that even their voice sounds foreign, how easily respect can die when pride starts to grow. He had seen that change happen slowly, like watching a candle burn out one layer at a time. But tonight, he understood something deeper, that love without respect is just decoration. It looks warm, but it doesn't keep you alive. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Memories flooded in, the long shifts at the factory, the smell of grease on his hands, the sound of his son's laughter echoing through the small two-room house they once shared. He remembered holding that little boy when he had nightmares, staying awake during storms just to make sure the roof didn't leak, skipping meals so there'd be enough food for school lunches. Every sacrifice had been made with one thought, that the boy would grow into a man who remembered where he came from. But life has a strange way of turning its lessons backward. Sometimes, the more you give, the less they value. Sometimes, the comfort you create becomes the very thing that blinds them to gratitude. His son had grown in comfort, never hungry, never cold, never afraid. And because of that, he had mistaken kindness for weakness. The old man opened his notebook again, the same one where he kept records, numbers, and truths. He began to write slowly, each word deliberate. He broke my phone, but not my spirit. He broke connection, but not control. He broke glass, but not my will. He paused, the pen trembling slightly in his hand. There was no anger in his heart anymore, only understanding. Anger, he knew, was a fire that burned the one who held it. But understanding, that was ice. It preserved, it clarified, it lasted. And clarity, he realized, was power. He thought about how his son had mocked him for being old-fashioned, how he'd laughed at his father's slow pace, his careful way of speaking, his need to document things on paper. But it was that very habit, that discipline, that would become his greatest strength now. The son might have youth, but the father had time-tested wisdom. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city was quiet, the streets glistening from earlier rain. The reflection of streetlights shimmered across puddles, reminding him of all the nights he'd walked home after double shifts, soaked but proud. Pride had always been his armor. Not arrogance, but the quiet pride of a man who had built something from nothing. He realized now that he still had that armor. His son had cracked his heart, but not his foundation. The foundation was built on something his son couldn't destroy: principles. And tomorrow he would use those principles not for revenge, but for correction. He picked up the phone again. Its broken screen no longer worked, but he didn't need it to. The SIM card inside still carried numbers, contacts, proof. Proof of every transfer, every deal, every favor that had helped build his son's life. He smiled faintly. Sometimes, all it takes to turn arrogance into humility is reminding someone who built their world. He knew one call could do that. Not a scream, not a confrontation, just a call. He knew exactly who to call to. His son's entire success rested on relationships, business partners, investors, clients, all of whom respected the old man far more than they did the boy who shouted louder than he listened. But before making that call, he wanted to prepare. He wasn't going to act out of emotion. He was going to act out of principle. He would show his son what accountability looked like, not through fury, but through fact. He took out a file from the drawer. Old business papers, contracts, ownership documents. They smelled faintly of dust and time. His name appeared on every page that mattered. His signature, slow, neat, deliberate, sat beside the lines that gave his son power. Without that signature, there would have been no company, no funding, no career. The son had forgotten that. But paper doesn't forget. He spent hours reviewing everything, marking details with his pen, highlighting key phrases. The precision felt calming. Every word on those pages was proof that respect had once existed, and that it could be reclaimed through law, not argument. By the time the clock struck midnight, he felt a strange peace. He hadn't felt that way in years, not since before his wife's passing. He wasn't restless anymore. He wasn't afraid. He was simply ready. He whispered softly to himself, "He taught me how far silence can stretch. Now I'll teach him how deep silence can strike." It wasn't a curse, it was a promise, a father's final lesson. He gathered the papers neatly, tucked the SIM card into an envelope, and placed both beside the notebook. The next morning, those would go with him to his lawyer, not to sue, not to punish, but to secure. He would make one calm, strategic call, the kind that couldn't be undone by apology or tears. Before turning in for the night, he glanced at the chair where he used to sit beside his son years ago, watching television together. That space was empty now, but not painful. The emptiness had turned into something else: freedom. He finally understood that love doesn't mean staying where you are disrespected. It doesn't mean waiting to be valued again. It means preserving yourself enough to walk away and still wish them peace. He turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness, feeling something powerful in the quiet: control. The kind of control that comes from restraint, from knowing you could destroy someone but choosing instead to teach them. Tomorrow would come with clarity and consequence. His son would learn what it means to break something sacred, not through anger, but through realization. The old man smiled faintly in the dark. One broken phone, one call, one lesson that would last a lifetime. And as he drifted into sleep, he thought, respect, once lost, can never be demanded. It can only be returned through understanding. His son would understand soon enough. Morning came quietly, without apology. The light that poured through the window was soft but revealing, the kind that shows every detail, every speck of dust, every truth that can no longer hide. The old man woke before dawn, not because of habit, but because his mind had already begun the work. He had made his decision. There would be no hesitation, no second guessing, no emotion left to cloud his judgment. Today, one call would rewrite everything. He brewed a cup of tea and sat by the table, the same spot where the shattered phone still rested. The cracks on its screen glimmered faintly in the morning light, like lightning frozen in glass. It no longer looked broken to him. It looked symbolic, like an emblem of a lesson long overdue. He didn't see damage anymore. He saw direction. The time for silence had passed. He reached for the notebook again, turning to the page where he'd written his thoughts the night before. Under the final line, "Tomorrow, I will make a call that will fix more than glass." He drew a single line beneath it. A seal. A promise, kept. Then, with slow hands, he gathered everything he needed. The envelope containing the SIM card, the business papers, the contacts list he had written by hand. He didn't need the device itself anymore. He knew every number that mattered by heart. He took a deep breath, picked up his landline, and dialed the first number. The sound of each tone was deliberate, each click like a step forward on a long path that had been waiting for him. When the line connected, he didn't speak immediately. He let the silence hang for a few seconds, calm, powerful, measured. Then, with a steady voice, he introduced himself. It was a call to a man he had known for decades. Not a friend, not exactly an ally, but someone who respected him. A man who had worked with him during the early years when the company was still built on sweat and handshake deals. Someone who had watched the son grow from a polite boy into a reckless businessman. The father didn't ask for favors. He didn't need to. He simply explained what had happened. The facts, the documents, the misuse, the attitude, the warning signs. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He spoke with the kind of calm that makes people listen harder. On the other end, the man said very little. But silence, when it comes from someone with authority, means agreement. The father didn't need to ask for action. He knew it would come naturally. The truth has its own way of moving through networks, through words and whispers and records. He had placed the first stone. Gravity would handle the rest. After ending the first call, he made another, this one to the accountant, a man who had always respected the father's integrity but had long grown tired of the son's arrogance. The old man spoke briefly, instructing him to send copies of certain financial documents to a regulatory office. He didn't mention the son's name directly. He didn't need to. The documents would speak for themselves. The next call was to an investor. Not the biggest one, but the most cautious. The kind who watched everything closely. The father didn't slander or accuse. He simply shared concerns about stability and management behavior. The investor understood immediately. Money moves faster than morality, and concern is the only whisper it needs to change direction. By the time the old man finished his fourth call, the web had already begun to tighten. Each person he contacted would reach 3 more by noon, and within a day, questions would start appearing where his son least expected them. In boardrooms, in banks, in meetings he didn't control. He placed the phone down and looked at the clock. Barely 9 a.m. His hands were steady, his heart slow and calm. It wasn't satisfaction he felt. It was clarity. The kind of peace that comes when you know justice doesn't always need to roar. Sometimes it only needs to breathe. He sat back, sipping his tea as the city came alive outside. Cars moved, people hurried, life continued as usual. But somewhere, quietly, threads were already being pulled. He wasn't angry at his son anymore. He was simply letting him face the truth, that power borrowed from others can vanish the moment respect does. Later that morning, his phone rang. The landline, crisp and clear. It was the first man he had called, the old business associate. The voice on the other end was low, professional, but tinged with something else, caution. He informed him that questions were already being raised about his son's recent decisions. A few meetings had been scheduled. Nothing aggressive, just formal. The kind of meetings that make arrogant men sweat in silence. The old man thanked him and said only one thing before hanging up. Let the truth do its work. Hours passed. The day unfolded slowly, the way all important days do. He didn't pace. He didn't check for updates. He knew enough about how systems worked to understand that once truth starts moving, it doesn't stop until it reaches balance. He spent the afternoon tending to his small garden, trimming, watering, touching the soil that had always given him peace. He found comfort in the sound of birds, in the smell of earth, in the reminder that growth requires patience and pruning. Some branches, he thought, have to be cut for the tree to live. By evening, his phone rang again. Another associate, this time a man from the finance department. His tone was different, serious, alert. There are audits being requested, he said. People are reviewing old files. There's talk about who approved what. The father listened quietly, nodding, even though no one could see him. The process had begun. His son's empire, built on borrowed authority and inherited trust, was finally facing the same scrutiny he had once mocked others for. The father didn't feel joy. What he felt was order returning, a balance restored in a world that had tilted too far in favor of arrogance. That night, he sat at his table again. But this time, the broken phone wasn't there. He had placed it in a drawer, no longer needing to see it. The symbol had served its purpose. Now, it was just a memory, a reminder that control isn't about force, but direction. He thought about his son, the boy who once used to run into his arms after school, who used to cry when he scraped his knees, who used to say, "I want to be just like you." Somewhere along the line, that boy had been replaced by a man who thought strength came from domination. But now, life was teaching him otherwise, that strength without humility collapses under its own weight. The old man didn't wish him ruin. He wished him realization. He hoped that when his son's pride began to crumble, he'd finally see the truth, that respect is the real inheritance, that the people who built you can also unbuild you quietly without ever raising a hand. Before going to bed, he made one final call, to himself, in a way. He picked up the phone, dialed his own number, and listened to it ring. It was symbolic, absurd even, but it made sense to him. Because sometimes you need to call yourself back, to remember who you were before pain turned you silent. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times, then hung up, and he smiled. He didn't need to do anything more. The world would handle the rest. His son would wake up tomorrow to phone calls, not from him, but from people who mattered in his new world. People who asked questions that couldn't be dodged. People who didn't forgive arrogance. He had slammed a phone to silence his father. Now the world would answer with the same sound, not of glass breaking, but of illusions shattering. And as the old man turned off the lights, he whispered into the quiet, "One call is enough. The rest will find him." Then he went to sleep, peacefully, because sometimes justice doesn't come with noise. It comes with the soft click of a phone receiver being set down after the truth has been spoken. By the next morning, the quiet had changed its tone. It wasn't silence anymore. It was movement hiding beneath calm, like the still surface of water concealing deep, steady currents below. The father sensed it the moment he woke. He didn't need a phone call or a message to confirm it. Years of experience had taught him that truth, once set in motion, never stays still. He poured himself another cup of tea, slower this time, savoring the warmth. The morning light touched his wrinkled hands, and he thought of how strange it was, that after all the noise, after all the humiliation and shouting, the thing that brought balance back into his life wasn't force or anger. It was one quiet phone call, one honest conversation with the right person. By the time he finished breakfast, the first ripple had already begun to reach his son. Across the city, in a sleek office wrapped in glass and ego, the son was about to learn what happens when arrogance meets consequence. At first, it came subtly, a message from a longtime client asking for clarification about recent management changes. Then, a call from a supplier requesting to pause further orders until things were verified. Small disruptions like cracks appearing in a mirror. The son brushed them off at first, irritation flashing across his face. He had no idea the web was tightening. Within hours, his phone buzzed again and again. The accountant he depended on stopped answering calls. The senior partner requested a private meeting. No explanations, just an urgent tone. His inbox filled with polite, sterile messages, filled with one repeated phrase, "We need to review." By noon, unease turned into panic. He tried calling his father, but the number went unanswered. He sent a message, short, curt, demanding an explanation, but there was no reply. It wasn't anger that greeted him now. It was absence. And absence, when it comes from someone who once gave everything, feels heavier than punishment. The father, meanwhile, sat calmly by his window, watching birds land on the sill. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply breathed. The world was rearranging itself exactly as it should. The truth was correcting imbalance, the way gravity does after something is dropped. He had always believed that the world doesn't need to shout to teach lessons. Sometimes it simply lets people trip over their own pride. By the afternoon, the son's office had gone from bustling to tense. Conversations hushed when he walked past. His assistant avoided eye contact. The air was thick with awareness. Everyone knew something he didn't. The board had been alerted. The auditors had arrived. A quiet investigation had begun into financial irregularities, spending records, and personal expenses drawn from company accounts. All of it traced back to him. It wasn't revenge, it was accountability. Cold, clean, undeniable. The father hadn't fabricated a thing. He had simply opened a window and let the sunlight in. The shadows revealed themselves. The sun made call after call, trying to control the damage. But no one was listening anymore. People who once admired his authority now feared association. That's how quickly arrogance turns to isolation, faster than a man can finish an excuse. Meanwhile, the father's name began surfacing again in quiet conversations, spoken not with pity, but respect. The older associates remembered him, the man who had once run things with fairness, who treated his staff like people, not numbers. Stories of his integrity resurfaced like old photographs pulled from a drawer. In a way, his silence was speaking louder now than any defense ever could. He didn't need to be present to be heard. The world was finally remembering who the real builder was. That evening, as the sun began to sink behind the city, the son sat in his car, staring at his phone. The same phone he had once slammed in fury. It buzzed again, another message from an investor. "We're stepping back for now." His throat went dry. The silence from his father, the stillness he had mistaken for surrender, had become unbearable. At home, the old man's tea had gone cold. He hadn't left his chair all day. He didn't need to. His actions were moving on their own, like gears set in motion long ago. Every call he made was now a ripple, every truth unfolding like a page turning by itself. He thought of his son, alone now, surrounded by the noise of panic, the very noise he had once created to drown out his father's voice. And he felt something he hadn't expected, not triumph, but sorrow. Because this wasn't just a victory, it was a loss too. The son had fallen not because someone pushed him, but because he'd built his life on arrogance instead of respect. By nightfall, reports had started circulating among the company's investors. The story was simple: concerns about internal management, pending audits, irregularities under review. It was all standard procedure, legal, factual, unemotional. But for the son, it was a collapse. His empire had been built on his father's name, his father's reputation, his father's foundations. And now, those very foundations were shifting beneath his feet. The father didn't make any more calls that day. He didn't have to. The system was working exactly as designed. He had lit the fuse. Truth had taken over. He spent the evening reading instead, an old book his wife used to love. His hands trembled a little when he turned the pages, but his heart was steady. There was a peace in knowing that justice, when done quietly, carries more weight than any confrontation ever could. The next morning, news reached him through a mutual contact. The board had temporarily suspended his son from management duties pending inquiry. There was no anger in the decision, only order. The son had tried to rule without humility, and the world had reminded him what real control looks like. The father listened to the update, nodded once, and simply said, "Good. Let him rest. Pride needs silence to heal." Then he hung up the phone, folded his hands, and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt no tension in his chest. He realized that revenge wasn't about winning. It was about restoring balance. And balance had finally returned. He stood and walked to the mirror. The reflection staring back at him looked older, yes, but stronger too. The face of a man who had been broken but not beaten. A man who had learned that dignity, once reclaimed, doesn't need applause. As he left the room, he glanced once more at the drawer where the shattered phone was kept. He thought of the noise it had made that night, the crack, the silence, the humiliation. Now, that sound no longer haunted him. It had become the beginning of his liberation. Because sometimes, when someone breaks what connects you, they also free you from their control. He didn't need that phone anymore. He didn't need that connection. The only thing he needed was peace. And he had earned it. The ripples would keep moving for days, maybe weeks. His son's world would continue to tremble. But the father was done. His part was complete. He poured himself one last cup of tea, looked out the window, and whispered quietly, "Let the lesson teach itself." It took only a few days for silence to turn into shock. What had begun as whispers in office hallways had now grown into formal meetings, reports, and memos that carried his son's name like a shadow. The consequences of pride, long delayed, had arrived with quiet precision. No explosions, no drama, just the cold unfolding of truth. The father woke early that morning, as he always did, but something in the air felt different. It was lighter, quieter, cleaner, as if the weight that had lived in his chest for years was finally gone. He poured himself tea and watched the steam rise. He wasn't waiting for news. He already knew what would happen next. The truth always has a schedule of its own. Across the city, his son's office buzzed with chaos. The board had called for an emergency meeting. Documents had surfaced, records, financial logs, correspondence, all pointing to a series of questionable decisions, all approved under his name. The son arrived late, dressed sharply as always, but his confidence had cracks now. Eyes turned away when he walked in. Whispers stopped mid-sentence. The father's first call, that simple, measured act, had found its way into every corner of the empire the son thought he ruled. Bank statements had been flagged. Transactions had been reviewed. Partners who once ignored his arrogance were now quoting regulations and compliance clauses. The world that once applauded him had shifted its gaze to the man he had humiliated. The meeting began with formality, but within minutes it turned into confrontation. Questions came like waves, calm at first, then relentless. Why were these funds moved without approval? Who authorized this? What's the source of this payment? Every answer led to another question. Every excuse made the silence heavier. His son looked around the table for support, but none came. The same people who once laughed at his jokes now scribbled notes instead. The charm that had once worked on everyone had lost its effect. Even his closest ally, a man who had dined at their family table once, refused to meet his eyes. Outside that room, in another part of the city, the father sat by the window, unaware of the specifics, but knowing exactly how it would unfold. He had lived long enough to understand human nature. When a man's mask cracks, people don't rush to fix it. They step back to avoid being blamed for its fall. By noon, the son had stormed out of the meeting, red-faced and trembling. He called his father again, 5 times in a row, but none of the calls were answered. The father wasn't being cruel. He simply had nothing left to say. The silence was no longer a punishment. It was peace. A few hours later, one of the father's oldest friends called. "It's done," the voice said. "They've suspended him. The investigation will continue." The old man nodded, his eyes unmoving from the window. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He just sat there, breathing deeply, letting the moment pass through him. He thought back to that night, the night of the broken phone. How small it seemed now compared to the lesson that followed. The sound of shattering glass had echoed far beyond that room. It had reached boardrooms, bank offices, and private meetings, all because truth moves quietly but effectively. Later that evening, there was a knock on his door. He opened it to find his son standing there. The same son who once stood tall and proud now looked like a stranger, smaller somehow, stripped of the arrogance that used to fill every room he entered. His eyes were red, his voice cracked, his confidence gone. The father said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried every answer. The son tried to speak, excuses, justifications, fragments of apology, but no sound seemed strong enough to fill the space between them. The old man's gaze was steady, unflinching, not angry, but distant, as if looking at a memory rather than a person. Finally, the son looked down, muttering something about bad luck and unfair treatment. That was when the father realized his son still didn't understand. He still thought this was misfortune, not consequence. He still believed in chance, not character. The father quietly stepped aside, letting him in. They sat at the table, the same table where the phone had shattered, the same spot where this cycle had begun. The son fidgeted, looking everywhere but at his father. The air was heavy with unspoken history. The father finally spoke, his tone low but steady. He didn't lecture, didn't scold, didn't explain what the son already knew. He simply said, "When you slammed that phone, you weren't breaking plastic. You were breaking respect. I built your world on that respect. When it cracked, everything you built above it was bound to fall." The son didn't reply. He couldn't. The truth, when spoken calmly, cut sharper than shouting ever could. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan, turning slowly, as if marking the passing of everything that once was. Eventually, the son stood up to leave. The father didn't stop him. There was nothing left to hold. When the door closed, the old man sat back down and exhaled. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was acceptance. He hadn't wanted revenge. He had wanted understanding. But sometimes understanding comes only after the storm has cleared everything else away. Days passed. News spread quietly through the business world. The son's suspension became permanent. Investors withdrew, and a new board took over. The company survived, but it no longer bore the family name. That name, once associated with trust and honor, had been tarnished too deeply to repair, at least for now. But the father didn't care about names or reputation anymore. What mattered was peace, and peace, he learned, often grows best after loss. He spent his mornings tending the small plants on his balcony, his afternoons reading, and his evenings watching the sky turn from gold to blue. Sometimes he thought of his son, not with anger, but with hope that maybe one day he'd understand that respect isn't inherited, it's earned every day. One night, as he sat alone with his tea, he received a letter, a simple envelope, handwritten. It was from his son. Inside, a few words. "I'm sorry. I didn't see what I became until I lost it." The father closed the letter and set it aside. He didn't cry. He didn't reply. But for the first time, he smiled, not because his son had apologized, but because he had finally seen. The revelation wasn't about power or revenge or who won and who lost. It was about sight, about how blindness to love and gratitude can destroy everything, and how clarity, even when it comes too late, is still a gift. That night, the father stood by the window and looked out at the quiet city. Somewhere out there, his son was beginning again. Smaller, humbler, perhaps wiser. And the father? He had no hatred left. Only peace. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't taking something away. It's letting someone face the truth they built their life avoiding. And in that truth, the father found the one thing that had eluded him for years: rest. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. In the weeks that followed, silence became the son's closest companion. Gone were the late-night calls from clients, the laughter of employees, and the constant buzz of admiration that once surrounded his name. The empire he had built on arrogance now stood empty. Polished walls, spotless desks, and echoes of footsteps that no longer came from people who respected him, but from those assigned to clean up the aftermath. Everywhere he went, people avoided his eyes. Meetings ended early. Old friends turned into polite strangers. Invitations stopped arriving. What had once been a symbol of power, his voice, his confidence, now carried the weight of shame. The world had not shouted him down. It had simply gone quiet, and that silence was louder than judgment. The father, miles away in his small house by the coast, felt none of the noise his son was now trapped in. He had left the city not to escape, but to breathe. His mornings were simple: tea, a walk by the shore, and long hours of reading. The only news he received came from occasional calls from old associates who still respected him. They spoke not of scandal or punishment, but of change. The company had restructured. His son was no longer in control, and slowly, reputation, the one built by the father's honesty decades ago, was being restored under new leadership. The father listened, said little, and thanked them for their words. He felt no joy in his son's fall. There was no pleasure in being right, only a quiet recognition that actions had finally aligned with truth. Back in the city, the son's downfall spread in quiet waves. He tried to rebuild, to find investors, to explain what had happened. But words that once carried power now sounded hollow. People nodded, but didn't believe. Apologies mixed with excuses, and sincerity drowned under the weight of history. His arrogance had made too many enemies, and his downfall was not a tragedy to them. It was a warning. He reached out to family, hoping blood might forgive what pride had destroyed. But the responses were distant, unsure. The cousins who once sought his approval now avoided his name. Even his wife, exhausted from years of defending him, began to withdraw into her own silence. The walls that once kept others out now closed in on him. One evening, in a rare act of humility, the son wrote a letter to his father. It wasn't elegant or grand, just a few lines on cheap paper. He confessed that he had lost everything. Not just the company or the money, but the one thing that made it all matter: his father's respect. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even expect a reply. He only wanted his father to know that he finally understood. The letter arrived a week later, carried by a postman who recognized the old man by name. When the father opened it, his hands trembled slightly. He read every word slowly, as if trying to measure the years between the sentences. There were no tears, no outburst of emotion, just a long, steady exhale. He placed the letter on the table, folded neatly, beside his cup of tea. He looked out at the horizon, the sea stretching endlessly beyond the window. He thought of the years he had spent teaching his son, not just how to work or succeed, but how to be decent, kind, and grounded. Somewhere along the way, that lesson had been lost, but maybe, just maybe, it had found its way back through pain. The next morning, he wrote a short reply. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't scolding. It was just one line. I never wanted you to fail, only to learn. He mailed it and went about his day. He didn't expect a response, and none came. But that was all right. Some lessons don't need answers, only time. As weeks turned to months, the son began to rebuild, but not as the same man. The fall had stripped him of titles and pride, leaving behind something raw, humility. He started small, taking a position at a modest restaurant, the kind his father used to visit after long days of work. At first, the staff didn't recognize him. To them, he was just another man trying to start over. For the first time, he worked without being addressed as "Sir." He cleaned, cooked, and served, and slowly began to understand the dignity his father had always spoken about. He never told anyone about his past. He didn't need to. His actions began to speak in ways words never had. The arrogance that once defined him was replaced by quiet effort. And in that smallness, he found a kind of peace he had never known. Back at the coast, the father lived simply. His days were quiet, but not lonely. He spent afternoons watching the tide and evenings tending a small garden behind the cottage. Neighbors greeted him kindly, unaware of the empire or the scandal he had once been part of. To them, he was just another old man with a steady hand and a calm voice. And that was all he had ever wanted to be. One evening, he saw a shadow at his gate, a familiar figure, thinner, quieter, carrying nothing but a small bag. It was his son. The father didn't speak. He opened the door and gestured him in. The son bowed slightly, not out of formality, but out of remorse. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. The silence between them was heavy, but healing. The son cooked dinner that night, simple rice and vegetables, and the father watched, remembering how long it had been since they'd shared a meal without pride standing between them. When they ate, no words passed, only a shared understanding that forgiveness had already begun in the space between bites. Afterward, the son placed a small envelope on the table, bank receipts, savings, his first earnings from honest work. "For you," he said softly. The father didn't take it. He only looked at him and replied, "Keep it. You'll need it more." That night, when the son left, the father stood at the door, watching him disappear into the misty night. He didn't feel sadness this time, only peace. Because this was how endings should be. Not loud, not dramatic, but real, earned, and quiet. The fallout had done what years of advice could not. It had humbled arrogance, rebuilt understanding, and reminded both men of what family truly meant. The son had lost everything money could buy, but gained something far greater: clarity. The father had lost trust, but regained something stronger: peace. In the end, no one outside their world would ever know the full story. The world would only remember fragments: the scandal, the suspension, the silence. But for them, the real story wasn't about loss. It was about how two lives, broken by pride, found balance again through distance, pain, and truth. Because sometimes, the only way to fix what's shattered is to let it break completely first. And so, as dawn rose the next morning, the old man brewed his tea once again. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, calm and vast, and he whispered to himself, "Some storms don't destroy. They wash the dirt away." He smiled faintly, lifted his cup, and let the warmth fill his chest, the warmth of peace earned through patience. The morning that followed felt lighter than any morning the old man had known in years. The air smelled of rain and sea salt, and sunlight filtered softly through the curtains of his modest coastal cottage. For once, there was no weight in his chest, no expectations, no noise, no guilt to carry. He had closed every chapter that needed closing. The story that began with a broken phone had ended with balance restored. He stood by the window, watching the slow rhythm of the ocean. Each wave rolled in, broke gently, and disappeared. Constant, predictable, calm. It was the kind of peace he had longed for when life used to be filled with shouting, deadlines, and disappointment. Now, there were no demands, no obligations, just time. Time that belonged entirely to him. He dressed simply, a clean shirt, light trousers, and his favorite wool sweater. Then he stepped outside. The small wooden porch creaked under his feet, a sound that reminded him that life, no matter how worn, still holds warmth if you listen carefully. He took a slow walk down the narrow path that led to the beach, his cane pressing softly into the wet earth. The world around him seemed to hum quietly, not with chaos, but with calm purpose. In the distance, fishermen were pulling their nets in, laughing and shouting greetings to one another. Children chased each other near the waterline, their feet splashing through shallow waves. The old man smiled faintly. There was something healing about watching people who still lived simply, who found joy in the basics: air, food, work, laughter. It reminded him of who he had once been, long before ambition had turned his home into a battlefield. He sat on a weathered bench overlooking the sea. The wind brushed his hair back gently, carrying with it the sound of seagulls and waves colliding against the rocks. He thought about his son, not with bitterness, but with the quiet ache of a father who had seen too much. The boy had made mistakes, yes, but he had also learned, and that perhaps was enough. He remembered the day his son came back after years of silence. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic scenes, just a quiet dinner, a shared meal, and a silence that said everything words could not. The son had left again afterward, but this time with humility instead of pride. That night, the father had realized something. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes, it simply means release. Back at his cottage, he made himself breakfast. Bread toasted over the fire, a boiled egg, and a cup of black tea. Simple meals for a simple life. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, because every moment now felt earned. He no longer rushed through his days. Each hour was a gift, one he had bought back with patience, pain, and wisdom. After breakfast, he sat at his desk, where a few photographs were neatly arranged, his late wife smiling in her garden, his son as a boy holding his first bicycle, and an old group photo from his factory days, men in dusty overalls, faces lined with pride. He touched the edge of each photo gently, as though thanking them for staying with him through time. On the desk beside the photos was a sealed envelope, his final letter, not to his son, not to anyone specific, but to whoever would find it someday. Inside, he had written not instructions or regrets, but reflections. Lessons carved from a lifetime of giving, losing, and learning. He wrote, "If you love someone, teach them respect before you teach them comfort. Because comfort fades when respect is lost. I gave everything, time, money, effort, but forgot that boundaries are also love. People take what you allow, and one day they forget to give back. So protect your peace early. Speak kindly, but carry your dignity like armor. In the end, peace is not won through victory, but through letting go." He placed the letter carefully inside his drawer and locked it. That drawer, like his heart, held closure, not unfinished pain. Later that day, he visited the nearby pier. The local shopkeeper greeted him warmly, handing him his usual paper bag of supplies: bread, tea leaves, and the newspaper. They chatted about the weather, the tides, and the new fishing boats that had arrived from the north. The shopkeeper admired how calm the old man always seemed. "You never look worried, sir," he said. The old man smiled and replied, "I've already lived through the worst kind of storms." The sea doesn't scare me anymore. That evening, the sky glowed orange and pink, and the sea mirrored it perfectly. He sat outside, watching the sun melt into the horizon. A few pages of his old book lay fluttering beside him, half read, but he didn't mind. Life didn't need to be finished to be fulfilling. It just needed to be lived honestly. He thought about the last few years, the betrayal, the anger, the humiliation, the night his son broke his phone, the moment he made that one quiet call, the endless days of waiting while consequences unfolded, and the slow, beautiful recovery of his peace. Every step had been painful, but every step had been necessary. He realized something profound that evening. Revenge is not about destroying another person. It's about rebuilding the balance they broke, inside yourself. He hadn't wanted to ruin his son's life. He had only wanted to remind him, and himself, that dignity has value, that respect has boundaries, and that love without accountability is not love at all. As the sun disappeared, he whispered softly into the wind, "We end where we began, learning how to be human again." He went inside as night fell, the cottage filled with the smell of sea breeze and candle wax. He placed a record on the old player and let slow, crackling music fill the space. He poured himself a small glass of wine and sat back in his chair. The world outside was dark, but inside it was warm, the kind of warmth that only comes when a man has nothing left to prove. The next morning, he rose before dawn, packed a small bag, and walked toward the train station. He had decided to travel, not far, just to see a few old places before time took the choice from him. The station was quiet, the kind of silence that hums with anticipation. As the train approached, he felt a calm excitement, not the restless energy of youth, but the serenity of closure. He didn't look back as the train moved. The sea blurred past the window, the horizon stretching endlessly. He watched as villages and trees flickered by, his reflection merging with the landscape. He thought about his son again, and for the first time, it wasn't with sadness. He hoped the boy had found his own peace, his own small cottage, somewhere far from greed. Maybe one day they'd meet again, not as father and son, but as two men who finally understood each other. As the train rolled through the countryside, the old man closed his eyes. The rhythmic clatter of wheels was like a lullaby, steady and soft. He thought of his wife, his work, his mistakes, his victories. He thought of how everything, every joy, every heartbreak, had shaped him into the man sitting there now. He didn't know where the journey would end, but for the first time in his long life, he didn't need to, because the destination didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he had left behind noise and carried only peace. And so, as the morning sun rose and spilled golden light across the fields, the old man smiled faintly and whispered under his breath, "One call broke my pain. One journey healed my soul." He leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the hum of the train carry him forward, not away from his past, but toward the quiet freedom he had earned. Time has a strange way of softening everything, even the memories that once burned like open wounds. Years had passed since that day, yet the old man still remembered every sound, every silence, every lesson that came from it. But the pain was no longer sharp. It had turned into something else, something calmer, wiser, heavier perhaps, but peaceful. He sat on the porch of his cottage one cool morning, watching the sunrise roll gently across the sea. The waves reflected gold and silver, just like the streaks in his hair. In that quiet, he understood something that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Peace isn't what you find when everything around you is calm. It's what you build inside yourself when the world tries to take it away. He thought about that day again, the moment his son had slammed the phone, the loud crack that had split more than plastic. It had split years of trust, effort, and expectation. But it had also split the illusion that love without respect could survive. For so long, he had believed that patience alone could fix everything, that time could heal pride, that love could outlast neglect. But he had been wrong. Some lessons require a breaking point. Some relationships must fall apart for truth to stand tall again. He looked down at his hands, once strong, now worn and veined, but steady. These were the same hands that had built everything: homes, dreams, futures. They had written contracts, changed tires, cooked meals, and wiped tears. They had held his son as a baby, taught him how to hold a pencil, how to shake a hand, how to greet people with respect. And these same hands had also let go of control, of bitterness, of pain. That, he thought, was the hardest lesson of all. He had learned that forgiveness doesn't mean returning to what broke you. Forgiveness means freeing yourself from the memory that someone tried to define you by. His son's cruelty, that single act of anger, had once felt like a lifetime's betrayal. But over the years, the old man realized it was also his liberation. It forced him to draw boundaries, to reclaim his strength, to rediscover who he was outside of being a father. He no longer lived to prove anything to anyone. The house, the business, the respect, they had all been illusions of permanence. What truly mattered was integrity. It was what he carried when everything else was taken. And in the quiet rhythm of his days, he understood how rare that is, to walk through pain and come out not bitter, but clean. He often spoke to the young fishermen and workers in the nearby village. They liked to visit him, not because he was rich or powerful, but because he listened, really listened. He never lectured them about life, never told them what to do. He only shared what he had learned the hard way. Respect, he would say, isn't about how loud you are. It's about how you treat the people who can't fight back. One day, a young boy asked him, "Did your son ever say sorry?" The old man smiled faintly and said, "He didn't need to." I already forgave him before he learned how the boy looked confused, but the old man didn't explain. Some truths can't be taught. They must be lived. In the evenings, when the wind carried the sound of distant laughter and the sea glimmered under moonlight, he often reflected on how things had unfolded. He didn't regret what he did, making that one call, setting things right. He hadn't done it for revenge. He had done it to reclaim balance, to show that dignity, once taken for granted, can return quietly and reshape everything. He remembered the exact feeling after that call, not triumph, but clarity. It was the moment he realized he didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He only needed to act with truth. That call wasn't a punishment. It was a mirror. It showed his son who he had become, and showed the father who he had always been. Over the years, the father's anger had dissolved into understanding. He came to see that his son's cruelty was born not from hatred, but from emptiness, the kind of emptiness that grows when people mistake power for love. His son had grown up believing strength meant control, that kindness meant weakness. The old man once blamed himself for teaching too much patience, for loving too gently. But later, he saw it differently. Sometimes we give the best parts of ourselves to those who don't yet know how to handle them. That doesn't make the gift wrong. It just makes the timing painful. Every scar, every bruise, every sleepless night had a lesson hidden inside it. The old man had stopped asking why long ago. The world doesn't owe explanations. It only offers mirrors, and what you see depends on whether you're ready to look. He thought again of that one letter his son had sent, the simple apology that arrived years too late. He hadn't thrown it away. He kept it in a small wooden box by his bed, alongside his wife's wedding ring and an old pocket watch. Sometimes, when the nights felt particularly long, he opened it, not to read the words, but to remind himself that even the hardest hearts can soften eventually. He didn't need his son's voice anymore. The silence between them had become a kind of understanding, a quiet bridge made not of words, but of lessons. They would probably never live together again, never rebuild what was lost. But that was all right. Life isn't about perfect reconciliation. It's about peace. And peace, he had learned, doesn't always look like a happy ending. Sometimes it looks like solitude that finally feels safe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the old man stood up and walked slowly toward the edge of the beach. The tide lapped softly at his feet, cool and steady. He could hear the faint hum of life all around him, the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of villagers, the rhythmic pulse of the waves. Everything felt balanced again, as if the world itself had forgiven him for staying silent for so long. He whispered into the wind. It wasn't anger that saved me. It was patience. The breeze carried his words out over the water, scattering them like small blessings. He smiled faintly, knowing they would reach where they needed to go, maybe to his son, maybe just to the world. In the end, the old man realized that his story wasn't one of revenge at all. It was a story of return, to dignity, to peace, to truth. It was about the moment he chose calm over chaos, action over noise, and silence over shouting. He had learned that real strength doesn't live in the hands that strike back, but in the ones that build quietly after being broken. He took one last look at the sea before heading inside. The stars had begun to appear, small and bright, scattered across the endless sky. He thought of his wife, his youth, his mistakes, and his victories. He thought of everything he had lost and everything he had gained in return. And for the first time in his long life, he felt that everything, every loss, every pain, every moment, had brought him exactly where he was meant to be. He turned off the lamp, lay down on his bed, and closed his eyes with a soft smile. His last thought before sleep carried him was this: he broke my phone to silence me, but that silence became my power. I made one call, not to ruin, but to remind. And in that single call, I found myself again. And as the night wrapped around him like a quiet blanket, the old man drifted into rest. Not the restless kind that comes from exhaustion, but the peaceful kind that comes from a life finally understood. Because some men leave the world loud, with pride and legacy, but others, the wiser ones, leave quietly, with dignity and peace.